Hello and welcome to our session, Making Art with Everyone in Mind. My name is Lauren Stichter and I'm the Director of Art Education at Moore College of Art and Design here in Philadelphia. And I'm also the current NAEA Special Needs and Art Education Interest Group President. I was invited by the good folks at GAEA to give a short presentation on inclusive practices in the art room. This presentation will include just a few things. Again, as we have such a short amount of time, I'm going to check my time actually to make sure I'm on time. We're going to talk about universal design for learning strategies today, as well as look at some sample art lessons and where to find additional support. So before we get started with my presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. The medical model looks at the person who is identified as disabled and tries to find ways to fix them so that they can access society better. The social model is flipped a little bit in that they look at the way that society and our architecture and world is designed and looks for places where those things are actually disabling the person from accessing it appropriately. So we're going to do a similar thing when we're talking about art lessons today and our rooms. We're not going to look at the kid, we're going to look at our lesson plans and our space and how can we fix that to be more accessible to all of our children, no matter who they are in the art room. I'm going to focus on a particular strategy called universal design for learning. Universal design, of course, comes from the architecture world when they're thinking about making spaces accessible to everyone, specifically without singling them out as other or different. And so I think immediately, of course, of ramps versus staircases. Steps are accessible to some folks, while ramps are accessible to everyone. And so again, that's how we're going to approach our lesson plan process today. Just a little quick quote here from the goal of universal design for learning, or UDL, is to maximize the learning of students with a wide range of characteristics by applying universal design principles to all aspects of instruction: delivery method, physical spaces, information, resources, technology, personal interactions, and of course assessments. I will give you a heads up, we're not going to head too much into assessments today. I feel like that could be a whole nother thing, but there are folks out there who are talking about it, and I think it's worth noting that they are there. I love this quote by Ignacio Estrada: "If a child can't learn the way we teach, maybe we should teach the way that they learn." And I'll go on to say too that when I was working at the School for the Deaf, and as I continue to guide my current students, I oversee in my purview our Masters in Art Education with an emphasis in special populations, which is the only one like it in the country right now, marrying art and special ed in this very particular way. But I encourage folks to be curious. There are so many solutions we haven't even thought of yet for working with children with diverse range of learning needs and abilities. And so just being curious instead of afraid of the unknown, not afraid of children, but afraid of the unknown or things you might not know yet. Lean into that curiosity and think creatively to find some solutions there. So we're going to start talking about classroom accessibility and multiple means of engagement. When we're working here at Moore, and then I've wonderfully, a few colleagues were very generous to show a few more examples, but we start with the classroom itself. Is it accessible? Can our children and young adults move around the room in a way that's easy for them? Can they reach things? Do they know how to identify personal space? I'm sure you can think of a few kids who are either always up on top of each other or a little bit anxious about being in a room with a lot of bodies in it. So thinking about how to define space for kids and young adults. An example here could be these little X's of tape on the line to show folks where they can sit. I also think about organizing the classroom in a way that is visibly accessible and how we're giving instructions on how to do things, specifically in behavior. Of course, we're always talking about what kids should be doing and what behavior should look like, including cleanup areas. what are the specific instructions on how to clean a brush is really important to note, and of course anything around that. But having those visual and written tools so that also our students who are English language learners can access instructions around the room. My colleague Sue Leike does some really amazing work with younger folks, really young folks, and thinks about how to access art from different places. So inside this woven hoop loom or outside of it, do kids, like that kind of containment, building in opportunities to have space where they can enjoy it in a variety of ways. Creating large spaces where folks can explore paint at a really large level, or again, maybe even thinking about access and how folks need to walk through or move through that space. And sometimes it's about mapping out the classroom itself and deciding where your lanes of access are. In the bottom right-hand corner, we're using tape again to define, how to get to the table, get to your materials, instead of the running around at times that we see with any of our kids, really. Multiple means of engagement. Of course, we're talking about communication. iPads are, and technology are certainly one way. Some cheaper ways and a little more old school are using things like PECS, or picture exchange communication systems, which is up here on the right. Drawing our own is certainly, as art educators, we can find our own instructions, or even maybe even make our own boards for pointing out needs or wants. And again, when these are out, they are accessible to everyone. We're not necessarily singling out kids. We're saying, here are a variety of ways to communicate in this classroom. Choose what works for you. If you don't have some of these things, a really cheap, actually I think it's free, widget online, you can create some of these picture exchange systems on your own. Unfortunately, at times, I think that the skin tone is very, well, quite frankly, looks like mine, and it's not as diverse as I would like it to be. I think over time, some teachers have been uploading revisions of that, which is great. It's a shared space to share those resources, but just a heads up that I think it's a part of the app that could be worked on a little bit, and many teachers are wonderfully. Okay. Sequencing is huge for any child or adult. Some students can take in a large chunk of information and get rolling right away after you give a demo in the classroom. Other kids need you to walk it through. And so I would say err on the side of walking it through, or chunking it, or we say scaffolding skills along the way. Some ways that you can do this are, one of my students created this beautiful black poster board with Velcro on it. And so they talked about how to sequence the steps, but also if a child ran into trouble later, they could go up and look for it, pull off the image or the description of each step, and either bring it to the teacher for more support, or just bring it back to their table so they could self-guide a little bit. Sometimes breaking it down into just 1 or 2 steps for a child can be really important and less overwhelming than getting a lot of information all at once. And then one of my favorite sequencing tools I've ever seen is made by one of our students here at Moore. And this is a tactile sequencing chart for a student who is visually impaired. As you can imagine, when this was introduced to the whole class as the strategy for understanding how to do this sewing technique, it wonderfully does not single out children for needing something specific that is different and might other them. It's this tool that everyone can engage in and enjoy along the way. Materials and tools. I encourage you to go hang out at our SNAE Facebook group, and we have a wonderful new website where over the last several years we've actually created documents, they're Google Docs, where we have teachers who have submitted favorite materials and tools over the last several years, and they get to have their name, an image of the tool that they're using, and a little description of how they use it in their classroom or even in their lessons. So rather than me walking you through all that, go check those things out for sure. There we go. And we're heading into lesson plans. And these days I'm starting a lot of my lesson plan designs with my students from the perspective of using a culturally responsive teaching pedagogy. I'll get into that in just a second. We're thinking about who we're teaching, what you're teaching. We're thinking about the barriers that your students might run into, like right? Like my student who was visually impaired, and then we created this tool that everyone got to use, but leveled the playing field for that one particular student. How are you teaching? Keeping expectations high while also making things accessible, and how to assess them in the end, obviously. So Dr. Yvette Jackson says, when the brain encounters information, especially during the act of reading and learning, or art making, it's searching for and making connections to what is personally relevant and meaningful. So if we want new information to stick in a kid's brain, we need to start with things that are already familiar and comfortable to them, and then we can challenge. It's also a really amazing way to build trust, which, as you all know, is crucial to making art and skill building in the art room. What is relevant and meaningful to an individual is based on their cultural frame of reference. And when we're talking about lessons, there are a variety of ways to enter in, but I think of two ways in particular that I've used over the years. One is thinking of the lesson plan that you need to do with your students, whether it's building skills or learning about an artist or whatever it is. And then thinking of those barriers and offering multiple access points to that particular lesson. Choice-based art education does this naturally, very beautifully, and of course TAD practices as well. And not everyone is quite ready for, like, I think some folks misinterpret choice-based art ed as this like free-for-all all the time, but try it with a lesson. See if just offering a few different ways to access that art lesson creates a safer and more trusting learning environment for your students. The other way that I've tried over the years is to take some time to observe what your students can do already with their skills. And that might just be some kind of trust building, lighter art lessons in the beginning, taking those first 6 weeks to look and see what your kids can do already. And then finding artists that replicate those kinds of mark makings or ways of making art, celebrating those artists and using that to build your lessons. I'll give a few examples here. So when we think of culturally responsive pedagogy, first thing that I thought of was like, oh my gosh, I have so many different kinds of kids in my room, so many different backgrounds. But being in Philadelphia, one thing that is universal for all of us is that we live in the city. And so sometimes I talk about cityscapes to get things rolling. You might find other ways to find commonality with your students. Mark Clay obviously has this beautiful cityscape. I had some students who I knew might have trouble creating straight lines in my particular class because of some low muscle tone or some fine motor skills that they were working on. And so I had to think of other ways to help them, or at least offer an option for them to create straight lines. And one of those options was tape. Natural straight line. And so we started working on these cityscapes, and one way that was offered to our students was to use tape to create straight lines. But it demonstrated to me that they could actually build a cityscape if they were given the line to do it with. And so they created these beautiful, beautiful images after layering and layering of these different shapes. We're talking about, shared experiences and storytelling. And unfortunately, too often I see a lot of this, we're looking at a famous image and then we're going to learn how to make the famous image. And then we get lots and lots of the same famous image. But you can also, it's kind of a bit of an unfair way to assess students in a way that's fair and accessible to them, depending on what their body is able to do. So again, we're thinking about how are we not testing the student and their ability, but how are we making art lessons accessible to everyone? And so while this artist, Henry Tanner, does painting, some of my students choose to do painting, others chose to do collage work because it was easier for them to rip and glue than it was for painting. But it did still demonstrate to me that they understood about storytelling, that they could make these shapes and these beautiful, beautiful images. I went on to talk a little bit more with these folks about a contemporary artist, Matthew Rosenbach, who's down in New Orleans. And I think a little bit about social justice in our current times and what we're kind of working through. But again, this layering of storytelling and printmaking and collaging. I just wanted to throw another artist in there for for you to consider if you're thinking about this kind of art lesson. Here in Philadelphia, right across from Moore College of Art and Design, is the Barnes Foundation. It is a private collection of artwork that has a lot of white people art in it. And because it's a private collection, it remains that way. They do have wonderful contemporary galleries where they bring in new artists. But this was a challenge. Like here in Philadelphia, we have a wonderfully diverse population of students. And so how do we start talking about these things? We started looking around the Barnes Foundation for other things that might be interesting or come from other places and not just a Eurocentric place. And these beautiful wrought iron gates that go into the gallery kind of popped out to my students. They then began to look at the portraits and think about who they were seeing in the Barnes and what contemporary artists made work that looked like that and brought that in as a part of the conversation. And ultimately, this was done with high school students. These beautiful mixed media pieces were done. They used printmaking, they used pastels, they did portraits and patterns and framework, and then back to those kind of wrought iron beautiful pieces. They were made out of cardboard and foam core to create this opening to their portraits, which is really amazing. And then when we're thinking about looking at students and the marks that they can make and finding artists who make art like our students, I found Keiko Hara. I needed to do some printmaking with my students. This particular group had some students with cerebral palsy, which shows up differently in every single child who is CP. But some of their movements were smaller or more gestural. And so I loved finding Keiko Hara's printmaking because it looked a little bit like the work that my students do. And so in order to build trust again, to work our way up to those linoleum carvings, which were going to take a lot of effort from some of our students, we started out with these cardboard prints with just gestures and then filled those in with watercolors. And so we're normalizing, I think, gestures that would have been assessed otherwise as not enough, or, sadly, just in another way. But this using work by Keiko Hara specifically just celebrates every kind of gesture that a kid can make. This also made me think of Ida Rittenberg-Kollmeyer. She does some work that I think is really interesting and almost childlike. And so I think in the future, she could be someone else that we explore and look at her work. Where to get support? We're wrapping up here, kind of at the end. Let's see. We have, again, the Special Needs and Art Ed website. I would love for you to go check that out. We also offer several grants to art educators in NAEA. We have our Facebook group where you should go post your questions. We're also on Instagram, Special Needs Art Ed. If you'd like to follow me and the work that we're doing at Moore, you can go to Moore Art Ed. And these two books are what I used quite a bit and actually teach a bit from these days. Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, and then Art for All is a UDL art book. They're both small, easy to read, and Liz Byron is actually still an art teacher up in Boston and still teaching to this day. And that's it for me. Again, my name is Lauren Stichter, and if you need to reach out for any further information, my email is at the bottom here. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your conference. Enjoy your day. Bye.